Well, this is an unusual way to be talking to people, but this is the only way that the circumstances have left open to us. And talking to people, and especially talking to some of our favorite people, is not an option. So here we are on the screens, and the current situation really raises questions that I'd like to address to um, the fourth century, because they seems to be a lot of our Christian answers are to questions that were already taken up in the early church. And so when you need to know something about the early church, you call Mike Aquilina. At least that's what I do. And so welcome, Mike, to this conversation.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rob. I'm looking forward to it. This is a topic I'm pretty passionate about.
Indeed. Oh, the main thing, the first thing that I thought of when all of a sudden modern medicine became the talk of the town, the thing everyone was thinking about is we talk about the marvels of modern medicine, but we rarely think, or at least most people rarely think about the origins of modern medicine. But you have done that and put it in a book that we published at the St. Paul Center at Emmaus Road Publishing called The Healing Imperative: The Early Church and the Invention of Medicine as We Know It. That seems like a really strong claim, the invention of medicine as we know it.
Well, I wanted it to be very strong. I wanted it to be provocative. I wanted to kind of put my chin out there because, you often encounter these urban legends about Christianity. You'll find these crazy claims online that Christianity is waging war on science, or that there's this Catholic war on women. But if you do the actual digging, you find that medicine, like most of the sciences, arose first in the church and underwent its most dramatic development within the church by Christians, especially Christian physicians who were animated by their faith. And not only that, but a lot of the development was driven by women who were, for the first time in human history, enjoying the freedom that they had gained under Christianity.
And I love, but first that title, The Healing Imperative, is kind of cryptic, but you root it in a command of Jesus in the Gospels.
Yeah.
And so it's not just, and then the claim that you're going to defend here is not just that it happened during a Christian era, that's when science came along, so of course they were all Christians. Not just during the Christian era, but because of. As Jesus said to his disciples, this is in sending out the 70, in Luke 10, whenever you enter into a town and they receive you, eat what is set before you, heal the sick in it, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near you. So two commands, two things to do, but as a growing up Baptist, I would have said, what he told them was go and preach the gospel. And that's true, but it was heal the sick first and then preach the kingdom.
And there are lots of reasons why you might do that, right? I mean, you might want to show the power of the gospel first through acts of charity, acts of kindness this way through medicine. What's very interesting to me, Rob, is that from the earliest times, the fathers of the church spoke of Christ as a healer, as a physician, using the medical term. We find that in Ignatius of Antioch, very early on in Christian history, 107 AD. We also find it developed in very interesting ways in Eusebius of Caesarea at the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century. And what Eusebius does is he takes whole passages out of Hippocrates, the Athenian founder of medicine, right? And he takes these passages and he quotes them and he says, that describes Christ better than it describes any other physician on earth. And it's true.
Well, that raises the natural question, right? Hippocrates lived almost 500 years before Christ. The sort of gold standard in medieval medicine was Galen, who's also a pagan who lived, in the early Christian era. In what sense do we then say that Christianity invented modern medicine, or what's the describe for us ancient medicine and what Christianity brought to it?
Okay, wow, where to begin? Well, what's interesting about ancient medicine is that it was mostly a freelance thing, okay? It was a father passing on his private, secret knowledge to his son, and then the son keeping that knowledge private, secret for the next generation. And the doctors tended to be wanderers. They tended to be traveling physicians, moving from town to town. And most historians suspect that those doctors were largely outrunning their last failures, okay? They had to skip town, when they did something really stupid. So they were moving on that way, and the information they kept was always in the family. It was kept private, and they were exhorted, even when they studied under an official teacher, they were exhorted to keep everything secret and not divulge the trade secrets.
Yeah, information is money.
It was a business. It was a guild, and it was an industry sort of, but it was really a network of freelancers. Okay, there was no such thing as a hospital. There was nothing like it in the ancient world. The closest we come are these institutions called valetudinaria, okay? And each valetudinarium is essentially a repair shop for soldiers or slaves. Because a soldier or a slave represents a big investment on someone's part, either the emperor or a landowner. So they want to get that piece of equipment up and running as quickly as possible when the guy comes down with the cold, okay? Or when the guy breaks his foot. So the valetudinaria were just repair shops, and they weren't for ordinary folks. They certainly weren't for the poor. They were just to get the machine up and running, whether it was the military machine or the agricultural industrial complex of the first century.
So there's medical knowledge, but it's for profit. It's applied for the rich and for their ends, right? For their either military or agricultural ends. So there's no care for the poor. And when it gets to its limits, when it's stressed by serious diseases that they can't do, it responds differently. And maybe plagues are a good example.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, as we're sort of dealing with one now, the idea that as plagues decimated the ancient world, especially the Roman world, their effect on Christianity was different than their effect on the population at large.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And we have ample evidence of this from not only Christian sources, but also pagan sources, that when the plague came to your town, the first people to leave town were the doctors. All right? They knew what was happening. They knew their textbooks, and they were able to do the math. They could jot down the symptoms, and they knew what those symptoms added up to. So they were the first to leave town because they knew there was nothing they could do to stop them. I mean, they didn't know about microbiology. They didn't know what caused these illnesses. They weren't too sure how they were spread, and there were no antibiotics out there, and they didn't even know the basics about washing your hands between patients.
They knew social distancing, get the heck out of Dodge.
Yeah, and maybe take your family with you, and you can't blame them for that, really. Yes. But what's interesting is that all the evidence we have, and even you mentioned Galen earlier, the great pagan physician,
right?
He was no admirer of Christianity, but he admired the way Christian physicians showed fortitude in these extreme circumstances, that they stuck it out. And we have ample evidence of this. As I said, the Christian physicians stayed in place, and they treated their neighbors. Not only their Christian neighbors, but also their pagan neighbors. Christian non-professionals as well jumped in, and they took care of their neighbors. They made them chicken soup. They cleaned up their bed. They made sure that the windows were open. And so those people who were cared for by Christians had a much better chance of survival than the people who were abandoned by their families. And you can bet that as soon as they got well, as soon as the fever went away, the first thing they asked for was baptism.
Right. So there's no cure, but just comfort care gives a higher survival rate, and at the risk of themselves and their own lives, and many of them would die. They followed Christ's. And maybe this is rooted in Matthew 25, right? Caring for the sick is caring for Christ as far as Christians are concerned, and the end of this world isn't the end of their actual lives.
Yes, and I certainly believe that that's why many Christians got into the medical profession. And it's very interesting to note that the evidence from archaeological inscriptions, the documentary evidence, all of the evidence indicates that physicians were the largest professional cohort in the early church. Not plumbers, not seamstresses, not carpenters. You think there would be a lot of carpenters in those churches, but more than all of those, more than lawyers, more than military men, all of these things. You look at the roles and what we know from the inscriptions and the documents. The most common profession is that of physician. That for whatever reason, physicians were drawn to Christianity, maybe, because they saw in Christ a kindred spirit, a healer like me, or because Christians were drawn to medicine because they saw it as a way they could become Christ-like, God-like, heavenly, even in this life.
There's one other thing that really stood out in your book as a contrast between the pagan practice of medicine in the ancient world and the Christian practice. The pagans were really good at making sure their stats were good, and at what I think a more modern mechanistic approach would call allocating scarce resources. Hippocrates says, when you've got a patient you realize is terminal and you're not going to be able to help him, abandon him. Don't care for people who are in really desperate circumstances, because it'll hurt your business.
It's going to make you look bad.
Right.
Right. So you wanted to get out of there, and Christians were in it for the long haul. There are the great accounts of the plague of the mid-3rd century that we have from Cyprian and from Dionysius the Great of Alexandria, and all of them were urging their people to stay put, to take care of the people who are around you and to give care. And that those exhortations were addressed especially to physicians, to care for people to the very end. What's interesting is that once the hospital became legit in the secular sense, once Christianity was legal and the hospitals could go above ground, they were mostly run by monasteries. And they became de facto research institutions, because for the first time in history, doctors weren't freelancers. They weren't keeping secrets. They were collaborating, they were sharing notes, and they were in it over the long haul, because, as you said, they had every motivation to leave in the pagan world. But then what they did was they carried medical progress forward by becoming de facto research institutions. And so many of these, as I said before, were run by communities of women ascetics or men ascetics, monasteries. Even today, we still have those records from the ancient institutions. And what's fascinating to me as I was researching this book is that I found that American pharmaceutical companies are funding research into the prescriptions that were written by monks in the 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, because they're saying, well, let's look at these herbs they were looking. Let's look at these drugs they were dispensing. Let's look at, what we can get out of the unguentarium that was discovered last week. Let's do an analysis on that and maybe test those things. So, I mean, modern pharmaceutical companies are seeing the value of the research that was done by our ancient ancestors in the Christian faith.
Yeah, so it's not just that there were hospitals and then there were some Christian hospitals. What we mean by a hospital is a Christian invention.
Right. And there was no such thing as any other kind for the first several centuries that there were hospitals. And what's interesting is that as soon as Christianity became legal, a hospital became something that was necessary in your city if you wanted to consider your city civilized. So, so it became an imperial interest. So the empire itself fostered the growth of these hospitals, the foundation of these hospitals, poured money into it, so that in some cities, ancient cities, you had as many as a dozen hospitals. And I love it because when you read the accounts of these hospitals and their medical personnel, a lot of them were these uncouth monks, right, who were driving the ambulance. And what was the ambulance? The ambulance was a wheelbarrow, and you had the sick guy in the back, and you had to get through the crowded bazaar in Antioch. So you have this uncouth monk, big bruiser of a guy, elbowing people out of the way so he could get the guy in the back to the hospital. And that's they were the first paramedics. There's so much that we have today, that we enjoy today, that we take for granted today, that the church gave us. And it wasn't just these giants of the faith, you know, the guys with the bald heads and long beards that you see in the icons. It was these monks who were like us, who were you know, a little paunchy and scratched their beards, you know, and that sort of thing. They were rude and uncouth, but they got the job done, and you needed somebody like that driving your ambulance.
Well, this is an amazing and I think a really timely book for us to go back and think about how it is in our modern circumstances. First, that the great the idea of a science, a shared body of knowledge of medicine is a gift that we received from the church, but also in terms of applying it now in our own circumstances. What are the ways that we can live that same spirit of caring for our neighbor in their illness?
Two things, you know, and these are the two things that were so important to our Christian ancestors: charity and hospitality. Those were the magic ingredients, the secret sauce that made the hospital happen when no civilization before the Christian civilization had succeeded in creating this institution. Okay, so charity and hospitality, whatever we have, whatever skills we have in our hands, whatever knowledge we have in our head, we have to give. It's a gift. We have it from God. We got to give it in turn, or it's going to rot inside us. It'll make us something awful. Hospitality, welcoming, not turning people away when they're no longer useful or they're no longer pleasant. You know, we stay with people. We stay with them to the end, and we love them even when they're hard to love. These are the two great lessons from Christian antiquity that we can inculcate in ourselves today and in our children and in our grandchildren. This is the time to do it.
Yeah. We can be grateful that we have even the remnants of Christian society where everyone's cared for, not just the rich.
Yeah.
And then we can lean into that and practice Christian charity in detail, and not just because we have it as a cultural inheritance. This raises one thing, and maybe this is another conversation that we should have, but your other book on the villains of the early church has a chapter on a guy who wanted to sweep away Christianity, but wanted to like keep things like hospitals and charity, and see if you could like separate that from its original Christianity. And I've been reminded over and over again of that story, as well as we see the difference between state action and true charity.
Yeah, that was Julian the Apostate, and he had a mercifully short reign. How did that work out for him? It didn't. He utterly failed. You can't make people be charitable and hospitable. You can't even pay them to be charitable and hospitable. It either comes from a conversion of the heart or it doesn't come.
Yeah, you can't you can't buy love. It can only be a gift. But Christ tells us we owe it. You owe no one anything but to love him. So
Yeah.
Christians are paying a debt of love that no amount of money can buy.
Yeah.
Like Mother Teresa, once she would have these people come and work with her, and they would do the easy things, but they would see her doing the hard things. And this American businessman said, "You couldn't pay me $1 million to do what you do."
Yeah.
And Mother Teresa looked back at him and said, "You couldn't pay me $1 million to do it either. That's not why I do it."
Absolutely. Amen. And that's the way it was in the ancient church as well.
Thank you so much. And we should do this again, and hopefully soon back in person.
Call me.